You really can't look away from the news coming out of India and Pakistan right now, can you?
No, you really can't.
That deadly attack in Pahalgam, and then almost right away, India launching Operation Sindoor.
Hmm.
It feels like the most serious things have gotten between them since, what, 2019?
Definitely. And these are two nuclear-armed countries, which, always adds another layer of concern.
It absolutely does. And the headlines, well, they just give you that snapshot, don't they?
Right. So for this deep dive, we're trying to look a bit wider. We're using the material you sent over things, looking at classical conservative foreign policy, some analysis of Pakistan's security situation, critiques of India's defense strategy, too.
Exactly. The mission here is really to cut through the immediate noise, give you a better handle on the history, the strategic thinking behind these current tensions.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's dive in. A framework that seems relevant here, mentioned in our sources for understanding these dynamics, is this idea of classical conservative foreign policy. Realism, basically. What's the essence of that?
Well, at its core, realism is a pretty, let's say, direct view of how countries work.
Yeah.
It suggests that fundamentally, nations are looking out for their own survival, their own interests. There's no world government, right?
Right.
So thinkers like Hobbes and later Morgenthau argued this leads nations to pursue power. And power here means, the ability to influence or maybe even dominate others.
Dominate others, that sounds quite blunt. So it's less about high-minded ideals and more about a cold calculation of strength.
That's the idea. And from that realist viewpoint, foreign policy isn't primarily about, say, universal ethics or being popular. It's about creating a stable, secure situation for your nation. And often, that means aiming for a balance of power. Thinkers like Burke, Rochow, who actually coined the term realpolitik, and Kissinger later on, they all stressed this need to keep different powers in check, both inside a country and internationally.
Right. Realpolitik, that practical, power-focused approach.
Exactly. Aimed at stability. So if you apply that balance of power idea to India and Pakistan, it's just maybe their actions aren't always about solving the root problems, but more about adjusting their relative power in the region.
Managing the equilibrium.
Which could explain why some actions that look provocative from the outside might be seen internally as, necessary adjustments.
Okay, that balance of power concept makes a kind of strategic sense. What else does this realist lens suggest about how nations should operate?
Well, realists tend to be pretty skeptical about international organizations. They see them as useful, sure, but only when they align with what the major powers want.
So limited utility.
Pretty much. They also really emphasize that diplomacy needs to be backed up by a credible threat of force. Diplomacy alone, often seen as ineffective.
Force and diplomacy working together.
Hand in hand. And they're particularly cautious about states that seem determined to shake up the whole system, these revolutionary states.
Okay.
The thinking is you generally can't appease them. You might need a firmer response. And finally, realism advises restraint. Don't overreach. Avoid getting drawn into conflicts that aren't vital to your core interests.
That's quite a set of guidelines. So looking at India's foreign policy, say, since 47, or maybe just since 2014, does it actually fit these realist criteria? One of our sources poses that question.
It's a really good question. And answering it, you'd have to look closely. Have India's alliances been mainly about balancing power? Has its diplomacy always had that military backing?
Right.
How has it handled countries it sees as destabilizing? And has it generally shown restraint? These are the kind of things you'd weigh up.
Okay, interesting. Let's pivot to Pakistan then. You mentioned how realism views revolutionary powers, states wanting to fundamentally change the power balance. Our sources kind of explore if Pakistan fits this description and how India might be reacting based on that view.
Yeah, from that realist perspective, if you see a state actively trying to upend the existing order, appeasement is usually seen as a bad idea.
So what's the alternative?
Often it's seen as needing a demonstration of strength, maybe even using force to counter it. Which brings us right back to the latest events.
Operation Sindoor.
Exactly. India targeting those alleged terrorist sites after the Pahalgam attack. You can definitely interpret that through this realist lens. A forceful pushback against something seen as undermining the status quo, particularly in Kashmir.
And it's not the first time, is it? The sources remind us about 2016, the Uri attack. India blamed Jaish-e-Mohammed then, too.
Right, which led to what India termed surgical strikes. Pakistan, of course, denied they happened in the way India described.
So, Operation Sindoor. Does it seem like another instance of this realist-inspired, forceful response to perceived threats.
It certainly seems to align with that pattern, doesn't it? A firm reaction to attacks India attributes to groups based in Pakistan. It's interesting to see the UK's reaction, too.
Yeah, what's that?
A bit divided, actually.
Yeah.
Some UK ministers supported India's right to pursue terrorists, especially given the nature of the Pahalgam attack targeting tourists, seemingly based on religion. But others were urging caution, de-escalation, maybe a more law enforcement approach. India's High Commissioner in the UK, though, was very strong. Compared it to the Mumbai attacks, vowed India would get justice, never forgive, never forget. Very firm.
Wow. And those tensions even boiling over in the UK itself with arrests at the High Commission shows how deep this runs.
Absolutely. And that debate in the UK kind of reflects the bigger questions. Some voices there question India possibly suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, warning against bulldozer tactics.
But others were calling for a tougher line.
Yeah, demanding action against Pakistan over alleged terrorist camps. One MP even suggested tying UK aid to Pakistan, closing those camps down.
It's just such a tangled situation. Accusations, responses, international pressure. Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Look inside Pakistan. One article talks about how their idea of national security is changing, moving beyond just the military side of things.
Exactly. It seems that there's a growing recognition within Pakistan that national security is broader now. It includes things like, well, the economy, political stability, cultural identity, even just the basic safety of citizens.
So a more holistic view.
Yes, they're talking about protecting political stability, ensuring energy security, national unity, cybersecurity, even environmental security. It's acknowledging that a nation's strength isn't just tanks and jets.
But the article also highlights some really serious internal problems Pakistan is dealing with right now.
Oh, definitely. Internal security is a huge challenge. Terrorism, militant groups, the figures are stark. Over 70,000 lives lost, something like $123 billion spent just dealing with the fallout from the global war on terror.
That's staggering.
It is. And groups like the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, they remain a threat, targeting politicians, minorities, different ethnic groups. This kind of constant insecurity inevitably affects other things, right?
Like the economy, I imagine?
For sure. It discourages foreign investment, makes doing business more expensive, just generally hampers economic growth. And on top of these internal issues, you've got external pressures mounting.
Such as?
The situation on the border with Afghanistan is apparently getting worse. And then there's what the source calls inflammatory and aggressive words from Indian leaders. Plus, the general instability in Afghanistan itself is a major worry for Pakistan. It could easily spill over and make their own security situation even tougher.
So it's like pressure from both inside and outside.
It's a real dual challenge, yeah. Internal fragility meeting external tensions.
A very difficult spot to be in. Okay, let's bring it back to India now, specifically its military. The sources talk about modernization efforts, but also some big debates happening.
Right. One interesting point is the apparent increase in funding going towards the Navy.
What might that signify?
It could suggest a growing worry about protecting sea lanes, maybe especially with China's Navy becoming more active in the Indian Ocean.
Makes sense. But there's also criticism about India's goal of Atmanirbharta, self-sufficiency in defense.
Yes, that's a major theme. Despite this big push for making their own weapons, India is still one of the world's top arms importers.
The article mentions it accounted for, 11% of global arms sales as of early 2023, and consistently high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which does seem to clash with the self-sufficiency goal. It raises questions, Is the ambition outpacing the actual capability? Or are they prioritizing immediate needs over the long-term goal?
And the Defense Research and Development Organization, the DRDO, comes in for some flack, too.
Yeah, the sources mentioned recurring issues, project delays, budgets getting blown out, still needing to import key components for supposedly indigenous systems. All of this obviously slows down genuine self-reliance.
And within the Navy itself, there's this big debate. Aircraft carriers versus nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs.
That's a crucial one. Huge strategic implications. The argument for SSNs is all about stealth, their ability to operate unseen, project power discreetly.
Right.
There's that quote. An aircraft carrier gains its strength from being visible, the submarine from being invisible. Carriers project air power, definitely, but they're big, visible targets, vulnerable to modern missiles, drones.
Whereas submarines offer that covert threat, and nuclear power gives them incredible range and endurance, right? They can stay hidden for longer.
Precisely. But the problem for India is funding a big carrier program and a fleet of advanced SSNs. That's incredibly expensive. It's hard to do both properly.
So a major strategic choice with big budget implications. The sources also mention the military's theaterization plan, creating joint commands. How's that viewed?
The criticism seems to be that the current plan might be a bit
Lovely.
partial, not going far enough to really integrate the Army, Navy, and Air Force for joint operations.
So maybe more reorganization than true transformation.
That's the concern. Plus, things like the slow production rate for the indigenous Tejas fighter jet. That could force the Air Force to keep looking abroad for planes, which again affects that self-reliance goal.
It sounds like even with modernization efforts, India faces some deep-seated challenges in its defense strategy and setup. Okay, let's just quickly touch on the wider geopolitical picture. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. You can't ignore China. Its strategic aims in the region, its close ties with Pakistan, the China-Pakistan economic corridor being a prime example, that heavily influences the dynamic.
And the U.S.
The U.S. has its own interests too, of course, often seeing India as a key partner, perhaps a counterweight to China. And one source throws out this interesting idea.
Yeah.
That for India to really rise as a global power, it might need to be more disruptive, not just focused on predictability and stability.
Challenging the status quo sometimes.
Potentially. It kind of pushes against that traditional realist idea of just maintaining equilibrium, suggesting maybe bigger ambitions require bolder moves.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in this deep dive. We looked at the realist perspective, the recent flare-up, Pakistan's internal and external pressures, India's military debates, all playing out against this bigger geopolitical backdrop.
Exactly. We've seen how these long histories, these realist strategic calculations, the internal issues in both countries, the debates inside India's military, it all connects.
Right.
And it really highlights why this current escalation is so significant. It's not just a random event. It's deeply rooted in all these factors. And the nuclear dimension just makes the stakes incredibly high. Any misstep could be catastrophic.
Absolutely. So as we finish up, here's something to think about, a final thought for you. Considering everything we've discussed, the deep strategic drives, the domestic pressures, the nuclear weapons, the external powers involved, what are the realistic paths towards some kind of long-term stability between India and Pakistan? It's certainly not an easy question, is it? But definitely one worth pondering.